A German officer wants to take Sophie to bed. She has her daughter in her arms and her son by the hand. The man grows impatient and says, "You can keep one, the other must go." She trembles. She can't decide, but if she doesn't choose, they will take both. What would you do in her place? We must go back to the beginning to understand how she reached that moment. It's 1947, the end of the Second World War. Stingo, a young aspiring writer, moves to Brooklyn in search of inspiration. He rents an old room and one day receives a note from his upstairs neighbors, Sophie and Nathan. They invite him to dinner with a poem. Stingo is delighted. Suddenly, he hears them being intimate, but within hours, the love between them turns into shouting and insults. Nathan storms out in a rage. Sophie follows him, pleading. He tells her he needs her the way one needs a disease, a tumor, like death. She bursts into tears. Nathan, furious, yells at her to go back to Krakow. Stingo witnesses everything. When Nathan sees him, he mocks his southern accent and says "so long," claiming he's leaving for good. Sophie, crying, apologizes to Stingo for Nathan's behavior, insisting that he's not really like that. Stingo offers his help, but all she can say again and again is "forgive us." As we can see, Sophie and Nathan are a couple who live at extremes. At first, they were incredibly kind and warm. They welcomed Stingo enthusiastically, even inviting him to dinner with a poem. Then, Stingo heard them having intense, passionate intimacy. But shortly afterward, a brutal fight erupted. From that first moment, it became clear that with this couple, everything is extreme and intense. Later, Stingo is writing when Sophie knocks on his door. She looks flawless. Perfect makeup, styled hair, and a sweet smile. She apologizes for missing dinner and brings him the food on a tray. Stingo, slightly embarrassed, asks if the sound of the typewriter woke her. She smiles and says she likes it. Her father also wrote at night. He was a professor and published articles warning Poles about the Nazi threat, trying to protect the Jews. That sound reminds her of his kindness. Almost unconsciously, Sophie covers the numbered tattoo on her arm, her mark as a prisoner in the concentration camps. Stingo notices, but she changes the subject, says his name sounds cheerful, and then says goodbye. Stingo is left fascinated by her beauty. But once out of sight, Sophie covers her face with her hand. After such an intense fight, one would expect to see Sophie sad, withdrawn, or at least stressed, but quite the opposite. She appeared at Stingo's door looking radiant. She brought him dinner. She said the sound of the typewriter gave her peace. She said her father was a kind man, and although his death was unjust, she spoke of him with serenity. And she complimented Stingo's name. Everything she said was pleasant, light, and positive. But once she was alone, she covered her face. For a moment, she revealed her concern. Perhaps everything is not as it seems. Later, Stingo brings the empty tray up to Sophie's room and finds her asleep on the sofa. He watches her until he hears the door. It's Nathan. Stingo hides. Nathan enters quietly, approaches Sophie, and she wakes up, thrilled. She kisses him, crying with happiness. He whispers to her, "Don't you see, Sophie? We're dying." But all she can feel is joy to have him back. The next day, Nathan wakes Stingo with overflowing energy, as if nothing had happened. He suggests spending the afternoon together. Stingo goes upstairs and finds them in costume, dancing and laughing. The joy seems euphoric. Nathan says they love breaking the rules and living in the moment. He looks at Sophie, kisses her, and calls her a gift from God. He's madly in love with her. The night before, Nathan humiliated and scorned Stingo, but that morning, he woke him with enthusiasm, as if they were best friends. He also told Sophie that he needed her as much as one needs a brain tumor, and now he danced with her and kissed her passionately. Everything was laughter and happiness, and the joy was so contagious that Stingo let himself be swept away. He forgot everything that happened the night before. He begins to understand. That's why Sophie forgave him. That's why, despite everything, they're still together. They have an intense, passionate connection. But is it really that simple? That overflowing of joy, is it genuine, or are they hiding something more? Nathan tells Stingo that he is Jewish and, ironically, fell in love with a Gentile. Stingo is surprised, as he thought Sophie was also Jewish, but she clarifies that she was raised in a Catholic family. Nathan recalls that when he first met her, Sophie was skeletal and pale, even a year after leaving the camp. As a biologist, he immediately noticed severe anemia, and he said it was a miracle she was still alive. He says she bloomed like a rose, the most beautiful of all. He kisses her again and again, and she smiles at him, grateful for making her blossom. Stingo watches with a hint of envy. Their love seems so deep, their story so perfect. Nathan mentions that he studied at Harvard and now works at Pfizer. Stingo asks Sophie if it was her father who taught her English. She smiles but says no. He taught her German, French, and many other languages, but not English. At the mention of her father, her expression changes. She stands up and says, uneasily, that her father was a civilized man in uncivilized times, and that's why he was killed. Nathan embraces her. He sits at the piano and begins to play. Sophie smiles and recalls her childhood, the nights when her mother played the piano and her father wrote. She says no child had such wonderful parents. But for a moment, her eyes go dim. Just a moment. Then she laughs and plays the piano with Nathan, as if nothing happened. We notice that certain topics immediately make Sophie uncomfortable. Her eyes lose their sight, her tone shifts, but almost instantly, she changes the subject, forces a smile, and returns to being sweet and charming. At first glance, she might seem like someone optimistic who prefers to focus on the good and not sink into the darkness. But if we observe more closely, that constant joy feels more like a shield to cover something she doesn't want to feel. It seems that what she does is respond with the opposite of what she actually feels, as a way of protecting herself from pain. And this is a reaction we've probably all seen, or even experienced ourselves. For example, after ending a relationship, someone might feel shattered inside, but instead of being sad, they laugh more than ever, act overly cheerful, and insist they've never been better. It's not that they're lying or pretending, but rather their mind is trying to hold them up. It uses enthusiasm to compensate for the pain and avoid falling apart. And that helps us better understand what's happening with Sophie, because the happiness she has shown with Nathan doesn't feel natural. It's exaggerated. They dress up, dance, play the piano, and laugh endlessly. But there's something in that euphoria that feels forced, as if they were trying to cover a wound that runs too deep, as if their happiness were, in reality, a way to escape the darkness consuming them from within. And then the question arises, how big must be the thing they're trying to hide? The three go to the fair. They get on the rides, laugh, and joke around. Everything is excitement and noise. Stingo is having a great time, but suddenly the memory of the previous night comes back. Nathan shouting, his rage, and that unsettling whisper, "Don't you see, Sophie? We're dying." But seeing them so happy, he decides to let it go. Soon they become inseparable. They laugh and share everything. Nathan and Sophie kiss passionately, and Stingo watches them in silence, fascinated, especially by Sophie. She starts taking English classes. One day the teacher reads a poem. "Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me." Sophie falls into a trance, as if that poem were voicing aloud what she kept buried inside. She writes down the author's name, Emily Dickinson. As she gets up, something shakes her. She's on the verge of tears, but when the teacher approaches her, she smiles and says she's just tired. Here we notice something interesting. When Sophie's alone, she lets the mask of happiness slip and reveals some of the darkness she carries. But the moment someone else appears, she pulls herself together, as if she were afraid of someone truly knowing her. At the library, Sophie asks for books by Emily Dickens, but the clerk rudely tells her that the author doesn't exist. She insists and yells at her, and suddenly Sophie faints. Nathan finds her, caresses her face, and tells her she's beautiful. Sophie whispers, "I think I'm going to die." Sophie's done everything to suppress the darkness within her. Whatever she experienced in her past, she needs to keep it buried. But intense emotions don't just disappear because we want to hide them. Sooner or later, what hurts finds a way out. And since Sophie doesn't allow herself to face it, her traumas start to manifest more forcefully. At first, they were just brief memories. Her father, her mother, images that shook her for a moment, but she pushed them deep down and carried on as if nothing had happened. Later, she heard a poem about death, and something inside her was triggered. She was about to cry, but forced herself to hold it in. Now, in the library, a seemingly trivial confrontation was enough to make her collapse, as if all the effort to suppress her emotions had drained her. And now she's so worn down, she feels she can't go on, that she's going to die. Unprocessed traumas don't disappear. The body and mind continue to carry them. And when we don't give ourselves the space to face them, they end up expressing themselves in other ways. Nathan brings Sophie home. As he looks at her, he notices the number tattooed on her arm and the scars on her wrists. He falls silent. Later, Sophie wakes up and finds a scene Nathan has prepared. Flowers, candles, dinner, and a bottle of expensive wine. She sighs. When you live like a saint and then die, this must be what they give you in paradise. In bed, Nathan asks if she was in a concentration camp. Sophie doesn't want to talk about it. He apologizes and says he just wants to know her better. But wasn't he already supposed to know? Then he gives her a gift, a book by Emily Dickinson, not Dickens. He reads her a poem about a bed prepared like a grave, firm, silent, eternal. One night, Stingo arrives at the house. When Sophie hears the door, she runs toward it, shouting, "Nathan!" but it's Stingo. Nathan hasn't come home. She invites him in, and he notices everything's been rearranged. She says that sometimes she moves things around to keep her mind busy. But when the conversation becomes heavy, Sophie moves closer, takes his hands, and reads his fortune. She tells him he will move mountains, that many women will love him, but Stingo's only thinking about her. Why aren't there more women like you in the world? He tells her he's writing about a boy who loses his mother. Sophie's gaze turns distant. She speaks of the guilt she feels for having survived those she loves, her father and mother, and her husband. Stingo is surprised. He didn't know that she'd been married. Sophie drinks, yet she smiles. She says her husband was her father's assistant. One day, the Germans took them both. She says her mother fell ill with tuberculosis, and desperate to help her, Sophie obtained illegal meat. But while trying to smuggle it, an officer caught her, and she was sent to Auschwitz. She shows Stingo the scars on her wrists. He asks if they're from the camp. She replies no, they came later, when we were already safe. Sophie was in a refugee camp. Everyone wanted to help her, but inside she felt empty. She says, I knew Jesus Christ had turned his back on me, and that only a Jesus who no longer cared could kill those I loved and leave me alive with my shame. She went to a church and harmed herself on her wrists, but didn't die. Stingo gently touches her face, deeply drawn to her. Sophie says, there are too many things you can't understand that I can't tell you. He insists that she can trust him. They get closer. She smiles, but just then the door opens. Sophie lights up. She thinks it's Nathan, but it isn't him. Sophie is in the middle of an intimate, almost romantic moment with Stingo. He's listened to her, cared for her, and treated her with respect. And yet she can't stop thinking about Nathan, the one who's humiliated her, abandoned her, even betrayed her. Instead of gravitating toward the one who offers care, Sophie feels drawn to the one who hurts her. But why? Where does that attraction to suffering come from? Stingo approaches Nathan's desk and finds a mountain of documents on the Germans. Sophie, slightly embarrassed, explains that Nathan is obsessed with those who escape justice. Stingo comments, it must be because he's Jewish. But Sophie reacts strongly. And do you think I'm not furious? These monsters are free while my father, who helped Jews, was executed. Before she can say any more, Nathan walks in. Sophie runs to embrace him. He explained himself by saying he was working on an incredible project in the lab. Realizing they were alone, he becomes uneasy, but Sophie calms him with a gentle touch and soft words. Nathan explains to Stingo his hatred for the Germans. They exterminated more than 6 million Jews, and many are still free. The next day, Nathan enters Stingo's room and asks to read his novel. When Stingo refuses, Nathan steals it. While he reads it in secret, Sophie distracts Stingo. When they return from the cinema, they find Nathan conducting an imaginary orchestra. Sophie smiles. Nathan takes them to a bridge, pops open champagne, and gives an extravagant speech. Stingo, he says, is destined to join the pantheon of great American writers. Stingo is fascinated. The next day, Nathan appears elated. He kisses Sophie passionately and tells them that he and his team have made a scientific breakthrough, worthy of a Nobel Prize. To celebrate, he gives them gifts, a red dress for Sophie and a jacket for Stingo. He leaves quickly but promises a celebration. Sophie wants to surprise him. She asks her friend Katz for help buying a gold watch engraved with his initials. It costs more than she can afford, but she doesn't care. That night, Sophie gets ready with great care. She even buys champagne, but when Nathan arrives, the surprise doesn't go as expected. His tie is askew. He looks at Sophie with fury and accuses her of sleeping with Katz. Sophie tries to explain, but Nathan won't listen. Stingo steps in and asks how he knows. Was he spying on her? Trying to calm him, Sophie gives him the gift that she bought. Nathan takes the watch, drops it into the champagne, and shatters the glass. He corners Sophie and shouts, "Why did a Polish Catholic like you survive when millions of Jews died? Was it your anti-Semitism that saved you?" They argue violently. The next morning, they're gone. Stingo looks for answers and encounters a man who once knew Sophie, but for some reason, he doesn't seem to think much of her. When questioned, the man reveals the truth. Sophie's father didn't defend the Jews. Quite the contrary. He was openly anti-Semitic and supported German ideas, writing texts to promote hatred against the Jews. Stingo is stunned, but the Germans executed him. The man explains that the Germans eliminated all intellectuals, regardless of their beliefs. All this time, Sophie had been hiding the truth about her father, about her past, about who she really is. But the most unsettling part is that the clues were always there. It's just that neither Stingo nor we were able to see them. From the first conversation with him, Sophie brought up her father without being asked. She said that he tried to protect the Jews, and she ends with a line that, at the time, seemed touching. "The sound of the typewriter will make me think of him and his kindness." But now, with what we know, that scene feels different. More than a memory, it seems like a strategy, a way to get ahead of any judgment, to take control of the narrative before anyone could question her. And Sophie not only softens the truth, she completely flips it. She turns an anti-Semite into a defender of the Jews, a regime collaborator into some sort of martyr. It's the same pattern we've seen in her before, turning things into their opposite. If the truth is too dark, the version she tells must be just as extreme, but in the positive, as if only an exaggeratedly noble image could cover the shame she carries. Later on, when Stingo asked whether her father had taught her English, Sophie grew nervous. She stood up and hesitated, and then repeated the same idea that her father was a civilized man in an uncivilized time, and that's why he was executed. But this time, she went even further. She didn't just defend him, she idealized her entire childhood. She said she had a beautiful life, that no child had parents as wonderful as hers. When Stingo mentioned that Nathan was probably obsessed with the Germans because he was Jewish, Sophie reacts, "And you don't think I'm furious too? That those monsters live free while my father, who was a good man and tried to help the Jews, was executed?" In that moment, Sophie felt exposed, and instantly she placed herself in the role of the victim. She insisted that she and her father were also victims of the regime. It all aligns with the well-known phrase, "Tell me what you boast about, and I'll tell you what you lack." Because when someone truly had a happy childhood, an exemplary father, and a clear moral position, they don't need to bring it up in every context. But when that wasn't the case, there was a need to justify, to exaggerate, to repeat the story over and over, as if retelling it might make it true. As if, by convincing others, one might be able to convince oneself. In truth, the signs were always there. We were just focused on what she was saying, not on how she was saying it. On her tone, her gestures, or her discomfort. Chris Voss, former FBI negotiator, says that reading people isn't as hard as it seems. People give themselves away all the time, through their body language, by what they avoid, or what they emphasize too much. The problem is that we tend to listen only to the words and miss everything else. That is exactly what happened with Sophie. If you go back to the beginning of the story with this new, fresh perspective, you'll start to notice many more signs. That afternoon, Sophie returns, but Stingo doesn't want to see her. She sits beside his bed, but he gets up. He decides to confront her and ask for the truth. Sophie, with tears in her eyes, says she lied out of fear of being abandoned. Stingo softens and tells her he wants to hear her, to understand her, but she warns him, knowing the truth will only make him think worse of her. He promises he won't leave, but Sophie replies he shouldn't make promises like that. She tries to recall what happened, but after so many versions, she no longer knows which one's true. As a child, she idolized her father. She worked as his secretary, and one day, while typing one of his speeches, she saw the title, "The Jewish Problem in Poland." One word kept repeating, extermination. Sophie froze. She went to the Jewish quarter to see with her own eyes those her father was condemning, children, mothers, families, and she said nothing. She couldn't confront him. Over time, the situation in Germany worsened. Some acquaintances from the resistance told her about the German Lebensborn program, in which Polish children who didn't meet the Aryan ideal were disposed of. They asked her to translate secret documents, but she didn't want to put her children at risk. Stingo is in shock. He didn't know Sophie had children. She remembers that a woman from the resistance warned her. If she didn't help, her children could be next. And still, she did nothing. Here we find a deeper source of Sophie's guilt. It's not just that her father supported the Nazi cause. It's that she, having had the chance to do something, chose not to. She could have spoken up when she read her father's speech, or helped the resistance, but she stayed on the sidelines. One thing I appreciate about this film is that, unlike many Holocaust stories, which focus on the victims or on the heroes who risked everything to save them, this one centers on a third, much less explored figure, the passive bystander. Represented by Sophie, those who were there, who saw what was happening, and chose not to intervene. And that figure is probably the one that appeared most often in real life. But there's an even darker reason why Sophie feels such deep shame. Sophie was arrested and sent to Auschwitz with her children, Jan and Eva. Upon arrival, the Germans carried out a selection to decide who would live and who wouldn't. Sophie tries to recount what happened, but the words won't come until finally she says it. Jan was sent to the camp, and Eva to the crematorium. Exterminated, the same word her father had used. Thanks to her flawless German and the skills her father had taught her, Sophie secured work as an assistant to Commandant Rudolf Haas. Hidden in her shoe was an article she had written with her father, justifying the extermination of the Jews. When she realized Haas desired her, she decided to act. She told him there'd been a mistake, that she shouldn't be there. She showed him the document, claimed she sympathized with the Germans, and that she had participated in anti-Semitic campaigns. She asked him to review her case, but Haas refused. He told her that even if all that were true, she was still Polish, and that alone made her an enemy of the Reich. Sophie didn't pull away. She pretended to give in, but she didn't plead for herself. She spoke of Jan, that he was 10 years old, that he was like her and fit the racial ideal. She begged them to place him in the Lebensborn program and raise him as part of the Aryan race. Sophie didn't just choose to not act in the face of horror. She tried to save herself by pretending to sympathize with the Germans and used her father's article as proof that she shared those ideas. And that's not all. The resistance had asked for help to save children who were going to be discarded for not meeting the program's standards, but Sophie refused. Later, she used that same information for the opposite purpose, to convince the Germans that her son did meet the standard, that he was Aryan enough to deserve to be saved. In other words, she didn't just fail to oppose the regime. When it suited her, she used it to her advantage. At the time, it seemed like a logical way to survive. But when the war ended, and the world began dividing people into the guilty and the victims, Sophie knew she wasn't on the right side. She wasn't an executioner, but she wasn't innocent either. She stayed silent, and when she could, she adapted to the system. That's why she lied about her past, because she feared that if she told the whole truth, she would be judged. And perhaps that's why she clung so tightly to Nathan, a Jewish man who hates Germans. Symbolically, Nathan represents the victims, and Sophie, by staying with him and enduring his abuse, seems to be searching for a way to pay her debt. As if accepting punishment from someone who represents those she betrayed could redeem her, even if only a little. Haas took pity on Sophie and promised that the next day he would bring her son, and that he would be taken out of the camp. Sophie was filled with hope. That night she repeated, "I saved my son. Tomorrow I'll see him. He'll be safe." For the first time in a while, she felt something close to hope. But Haas didn't keep his word. Sophie never heard from her little boy again. That's why she harmed herself in the church, until Nathan came along, and she began to live for him. Stingo comforts her. He asks her to live for him instead. She sleeps in his arms, and he holds her as if she were the most precious thing he's ever had. But at dawn, Sophie sees Nathan through the window. She runs to him and leaves Stingo behind, as if the night before had never happened. The truth is, burdened by so much guilt, Sophie doesn't know what to do with kindness. She's uncomfortable being cared for and treated well. Deep down, she feels she doesn't deserve it. That's why she returns to Nathan, because being with someone who hurts her feels more consistent with what she feels inside. The three of them resume their relationship as best friends. Everything seems to return to normal until one morning. Stingo receives a call from Larry, Nathan's brother, asking to meet because he has something important to tell him. When they meet, Larry gets straight to the point. Nathan is not a researcher at Pfizer. He does work there, but as a librarian. Everything else was a lie, a fantasy, because Nathan has paranoid schizophrenia. Stingo is stunned. Suddenly, everything makes sense. His costumes, his extravagant speeches, the imaginary orchestra. It wasn't just his style, it was a symptom. Let's take a moment to talk about Nathan's condition, paranoid schizophrenia. Understanding this condition a little better can help us make more sense of his behavior. Schizophrenia is a severe mental disorder, often associated with psychosis. Unlike what many people believe, it's not about having a split personality, but rather a disconnection from reality. This disconnection can manifest through hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, flattened emotions, and difficulties in social interaction or daily functioning. Since the symptoms are so varied, experts usually divide them into two main categories: positive symptoms and negative symptoms. Positive symptoms are those that add something to normal mental functioning, such as hallucinations, hearing voices that aren't there, delusions, false beliefs like thinking someone's following you, or disorganized thinking, speaking incoherently or without logical flow. There may also be bizarre or erratic behavior. Negative symptoms, on the other hand, reflect a loss or reduction of normal functions, like reduced speech, poverty of speech, lack of emotional expression, known as affective flattening, apathy, loss of motivation, inability to feel pleasure, and difficulty concentrating. These symptoms are especially difficult to treat and tend to be more destructive, as they leave the person inert and unmotivated. Now, one of the most common subtypes of this disorder is paranoid schizophrenia. In this type, the positive symptoms are dormant, which means that the person may appear more functional or normal at times. Unlike other subtypes, where a person may appear expressionless, emotionless, or completely disengaged, in paranoid schizophrenia, as mentioned, emotions are not as diminished. Still, emotional incongruity often appears, reactions that don't match the situation, along with irritability, anger, and extreme distrust. People with paranoid schizophrenia often have relatively stable delusions. For example, believing they're being followed, that their partner is cheating on them without evidence, that they have a special mission in the world, or even that their body is changing in strange ways. They may also hear voices that give them commands or hear nonverbal sounds. Visual hallucinations can occur too, though they're less common. This explains much of Nathan's behavior. For example, he's displayed delusional jealousy towards Sophie, as when he believed she was cheating with cats. Delusions of a special mission, like when he claimed to be working on a groundbreaking scientific discovery worthy of a Nobel Prize, and even auditory hallucinations, such as when Stingo found him conducting an imaginary orchestra. In addition, Nathan has shown the emotional incongruity I mentioned earlier. He explodes at Sophie without clear cause, swings from loving and idealizing her to devaluating her and treating her with contempt. Another important detail we discovered is that Nathan uses all kinds of substances, and that is extremely alarming because it can worsen every aspect of the disorder. Substances can intensify psychotic symptoms and, most seriously, significantly increase the risk of suicide. A person with paranoid schizophrenia can lead a functional and meaningful life, but it requires consistent care and a comprehensive approach. What matters is accepting the diagnosis, following medical treatment regularly, maintaining healthy habits, no alcohol or substances, and avoiding isolation. Larry asks Stingo to keep an eye on Nathan, concerned about his substance use. Stingo is surprised, but Larry confirms that Nathan uses white powder, Benzedrine, whatever he can get. Stingo finds Nathan and Sophie in costume, pretending to live in the 19th century, but this time it no longer seems charming. Sophie, on the other hand, gives herself over to the worlds Nathan creates, because in them she can forget everything. And perhaps that's another reason she stays with Nathan. She can escape reality. She can take refuge in a fantasy, live a story different from her own, far from what really happened. A world where the guilt and shame that haunt her don't exist. Nathan proposes to Sophie, and she couldn't be happier. But the next day, she arrives at the house in distress. She tells Stingo that Nathan became violent. He has a gun, and she's sure he's going to use it. The phone rings. It's Nathan. He shouts that Sophie is promiscuous, that Stingo betrayed him, and he's coming for both of them. Sophie and Stingo flee by train. He talks to her about Nathan's mental illness, but Sophie refuses to listen. She says they should have stayed, that she doesn't care if she dies, but it would hurt her if Nathan died without her. They arrive in Washington and rent an apartment for a few days. Stingo tells her he loves her, and he wants to marry her and take her to live in Virginia. She approaches him, about to kiss him, but pulls away. She tells him he should find another mother for his children, that it wouldn't be fair for them to have a mother like her. Stingo tells her they would be the happiest children in the world, but Sophie takes offense. She says she's going to tell him something no one else knows. She takes a deep breath and begins to speak about the day she arrived at Auschwitz. A German officer stopped when he saw her. He told her she was too beautiful and that he'd like to take her to bed, and asked if she was a communist. Sophie, paralyzed, shook her head. The officer walked away, irritated, but she gathered her courage and shouted, "I'm Polish. I'm not Jewish. Neither are my children. I'm a Catholic." The officer came back, looked at her children, and said, "Wasn't it Jesus who said, 'Let the little children come to me'?" Then came the sentence, "You can keep one. The other must go." She said over and over that she couldn't do it, but the officer warned her that if she didn't choose, both would be taken. When he called over his men, Sophie reacted on impulse. She shouted, "Take my little girl." She handed over Ava and clung to Jan. She had chosen. She sacrificed her daughter. She stood motionless, shattered. It's a pain that will never leave her. This is what Sophie has been carrying in silence all this time. Now we understand why she doesn't speak of the past, why she punishes herself and struggles so deeply to accept the love or kindness from others. Because she was forced to do the most harrowing, cruel, and inhuman thing a mother can experience, to decide which of her children should die. From then on, Sophie saw herself as unworthy, incapable of accepting anything good in life. But her guilt isn't limited to that moment. That triggered an even deeper guilt, accumulated from all the choices she'd made before. Choices that, though they seem justifiable, only fed the shame. Not confronting her father when she read his article, not supporting the resistance, pretending to align with German ideology. These were the choices she made to survive, to avoid trouble, or simply out of fear. but in the end they caught up with her. The title of the film, Sophie's Choice, we all assume it refers to the moment she gives up her daughter, but it goes much further than that. Perhaps Sophie's choice is a metaphor for all the decisions she made throughout her life, because not doing anything is also a choice. Remaining silent, failing to act, is also deciding. An uncomfortable reflection, because it calls all of us into question. How many times have we witnessed injustice, something that harms many people, and thought that as long as it doesn't affect us, it's not our problem? But, as happened with Sophie, those decisions, or non-decisions, eventually catch up with us. History reaches us all. Sophie tells Stingo the whole truth. She says she'll go with him to Virginia, but she can't get married. Not after what she's done. That night, they sleep in each other's arms. It's a desperate attempt to forget, to flee from the pain for just a moment. But at dawn, Sophie is gone. She's left a note. She went back to Nathan. She writes that she woke up feeling overwhelmed with guilt, with thoughts of death, as if ice were running through her veins, and that she had to be with him, whatever that meant. Stingo returns to the house in Brooklyn. The police are at the entrance. He goes up to the room and finds them. Sophie and Nathan together, lifeless. They chose cyanide. Stingo looks at them in silence and recites the Emily Dickinson poem Sophie had loved so much. Carefully prepare this bed. Make it with dignity. Let no noise of dawn interrupt this tomb.